France's finance minister says a US move to pull out of talks over a new digital tax is a provocation. Bruno Le Maire was speaking after Washington announced it was suspending its participation in negotiations to overhaul international tax rules for major companies, including the likes of Google and Facebook. The dispute over digital taxes brought France and the US to the brink of a trade war in January. For more, let's speak to our business editor, Stephen Carroll. Stephen, Bruno Le Maire clearly unhappy with this move. What's likely to happen next?
The French finance minister said they were centimetres away from a deal at the OECD to overhaul how big companies are taxed internationally. These were negotiations that involved more than 130 countries, and they looked at ways that big companies, and in particular big digital companies, would see their profits taxed in countries where they make money. Rather than the current rules, which sees profits funneled into certain countries and taxes being applied there. So it was something that particularly there had been a lot of pressure for in the EU. Several countries, including France, had announced their own version of a digital services tax. In France, it was a 3% levy on major companies on their digital revenues in this country. So what they had proposed was something that made the United States very angry, and the exchanges between them and threats of tariffs from the US led to a brink in January where, in fact, the United States agreed to take part in these negotiations. Now the US says they're no longer interested. They say the talks were making no headway and they have suspended their participation. So the questions now for France is what they're going to do next. The French finance minister says they will apply their digital services tax, which had been suspended during these negotiations. They will apply it from this year. So that means that the mostly American companies that will be subject to it will be expected to pay that tax this year. But there'll still be questions as regards what will happen to the negotiation at the OECD. Will that now continue with the United States, or could the US come back to the negotiating table later? Officially, the letter from Steven Mnuchin, the US Treasury Secretary, said they were taking a break from the negotiations to allow governments to focus on the pandemic and their response to the pandemic. But whether or not they will be interested in talking about digital taxation later in the year is something still very much up for debate.
Meanwhile, Stephen, there are reports that Air France is likely to announce thousands of job cuts, despite getting €7 billion in support from the French government. What more can you tell us?
Unions say that there are thousands of jobs at risk at Air France. Some reports putting the figure as high as 8,000 or 10,000 jobs, which would be about 15 to 20% of Air France's workforce. Bruno Le Maire, again in his interview on French radio earlier, saying that he hoped the figure would be much lower than 8,000. He couldn't speak to the figures that were being quoted in the French press, but did say that it would be a red line for the French government that none of the redundancies at Air France would be forced redundancies. Only a couple of weeks ago, we had the French government announce that €7 billion rescue plan for Air France at a point where the company has had to ground the majority of its planes, as most airlines have around the world, and had been burning through €400 million a month in cash. It's not a surprise that Air France is trying to cut jobs. We're expecting the announcements to come in the next couple of weeks. There are negotiations underway with unions from several different parts of the company. But if we compare it to other major airlines, Lufthansa cutting 22,000 jobs, that's 16% of its workforce. British Airways cutting 12,000 jobs, that's around 30% of its workforce. So the figures being quoted would seem to be in line with what other airlines are doing, but certainly the French government, which owns 14% of Air France, is going to be keeping a very close eye on how these staff cuts are carried out, and to ensure, as Bruno Le Maire said, that none of them are forced redundancies.
All right, thank you very much, Stephen. Stephen Carroll there, our business editor.